Yeah, and this might be a good segue to Plutarch. So Nietzsche has this quote. I think he's kind of talking about sheepdogs here, actually, in his text about the uses and abuses of history. He's sort of criticizing the historical discipline of his day, the late 19th century. So already he's kind of seeing this trend that we see just like running rampant today of, not really looking at history as a source of inspiration, but maybe looking at it to kind of break down institutions, to find faults, or kind of petty antiquarianism. But what he thinks like the sheepdogs of society, like the people who want to lead and shape and create a new nation need is this other kind of history, which is monumental history, which is what he associates most, especially with Plutarch. And so he says to the young men of his day, satisfy your souls on Plutarch. 100 such men, educated and matured, and who have accustomed themselves to the heroic. He says, learn to believe in yourselves when you believe in his heroes. 100 such men educated against the fashion of the modern times could silence now and forever the whole noisy pseudo-education of our era. And so for a guy like Nietzsche, the antidote, I think, the thing that people who are high agency or who aspire to be high agency need is that shot of greatness that you get from deep immersion in the historical paradigms, especially of the Greeks and the Romans.
And I guess when we look at, I have to ask you too, because I'm trying to figure this out. So it's kind of, because the focus is on you, is that Pompey over your left shoulder? And then who is that over your right shoulder back there?
So I've got Julius Caesar on one side, and then a bust that is sometimes called a bust of Sulla, and other times called a bust of Scipio Africanus. Yeah.
So I guess when we look at Plutarch, then the value in Plutarch's lives. So what are Plutarch's lives? What is the value on them? Why have you chosen to concentrate on that? I guess versus doing like, hey, let's do Suetonius's 12 Caesars. Like why did you choose to go that way? And I guess what's the value to the end listener in that?
Yeah, I looked around and I saw a growing interest in Stoicism, which I think is a generally a positive development, but like an interest in ancient philosophy, I think, kind of filling this void that especially men feel of like good advice in the public sphere. So Plutarch is a philosopher also. He wrote a book called The Parallel Lives, wrote many other books, but this is like his masterwork. 48 biographies of 24 Greeks, 24 Romans. And he kind of wrote this biography. Each one are, 30 to 60 pages. So they're bite-sized. And it became this incredibly influential book in the course of Western history, especially after it was rediscovered in the Renaissance. It's like The Parallel Lives of Plutarch is the second most likely book to be on your shelf if you have any books. If you're an 18th century American, it's like right after the Bible. Plutarch's Lives. It's, Machiavelli pores over it carefully. So what it basically is a collection of biographies written by a philosopher with let's call it a moral purpose. Like he sees biography as a kind of training ground for virtue. And he profiles all of these great men like Julius Caesar, like Alexander the Great, like Sertorius, Sulla, Pompey, and Pericles, etc., not with the idea of holding them up on an unblemished pedestal like they're saints, but to really dive into their characters and to understand their strengths and weaknesses and their virtues and their vices, so that his readers can bring out virtue within themselves and refine the vices away from their character. But the way that he does that is through extremely talented, entertaining storytelling. He has this dramatic eye for great moments, great quotes, scenes, and all the emotional dynamics of a situation. He also will kind of dispense with a lot of the details that you normally associate with longer histories. And he says this explicitly in his biography of Alexander. I didn't sit down to write history. And so I'm not going to recount all of the deeds that Alexander did and all of his wars for, in fact, a casual castaway phrase said among friends or when he's at drink might reveal more about the character, the ethos of the man than, 100 great battles. And I think he's really right. And that's what the purpose of reading it is. And the whole idea is you kind of like Cicero said, you get greatness first and foremost by osmosis. And he wanted to give you like a database for doing that.
I think the thing that's interesting, and this goes back to something you're talking about earlier, is to me, it's funny. I'm going back to a conversation I had with my former professor yesterday. I think if you look at the history I remember it because I learned the narrative. I learned the dates and things like that later on, right? I learned how to go back and put them in and make them make sense. And I feel like if you can make a great narrative, you can really make it interesting and bring it alive to people. And I think almost getting too much into the detail and getting too much into the specifics of it makes people not want to learn it, right? Because it becomes this big unconfrontable thing. And I think you're taking away the value from people, right? If you get so into like, okay, we need to know all the minutia and everything about it. And I think to me, that's been the biggest learning point in talking to people about the Roman Empire is because, listen, I'm your everyday person that knows history. I'm not as smart as you or other people that have a PhD. I only got my MA and that's as far as I went. But I feel like if you can take it and you can make it real to people, like you can just open the world up to them. And I feel like we're not allowing that. I think that's a big problem right now.
Yeah. And so on the show, I basically am retelling Plutarch's lives. I'm going through the biographies one by one and doing deep dives on these guys, but trying to kind of stay loyal to Plutarch's, his moral intention of like, hey, let's assess their characters. Let's see what their strengths and weaknesses are. But also sort of stay loyal to his scope and not go too long, which is often challenging because I find these guys so fascinating. But it's one of my criticisms for all that I respect a guy like Ron Chernow. His biographies are like 1,200 pages long. They're door stoppers. I mean, who gets through that?
You and I were talking about Adrian Goldworthy. Like, I love his books, but like he's so superfluous. You're like, do I really need to know all that?
Right. And Plutarch is really great for his restraint there. Like he's got a lot more material at his disposal, but he sees his job as a biographer as filtering out, trying to focus on just the essentials. So I try to do that while giving you enough context that you can kind of listen to the story.